On a spring day in 2006, a woman in Coweta County, Georgia, walked into one of the bedrooms of her home carrying a small black lockbox. After opening a closet, she cleared a little space on the top shelf. She then placed a handful of items inside before sliding the box into the back where no one but her was likely to find it. Now, this was not some spring cleaning project. This woman wasn't just putting old belongings into storage. She had a good reason for hiding this box. It's just that she hadn't yet fully accepted what that reason was. Over the months and years that followed, she kept coming back to the lockbox, and each time she would pull it down and add more stuff before quietly tucking it away again. But the longer this went on, the harder it became to ignore why she was doing all of this in the first place. This continued for about 3 years, until the woman reached a decision that something had to change. Sadly, though, the next time her lockbox was taken down from that shelf, she wasn't the one doing it. It was police. That's when it became clear this woman had been living with an awful secret, one that, much like this box, she had kept hidden from basically everyone in her life. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. On February 13th, 2009, Cathy McNaughton was feeling proud of herself. She had recently started a brand new job, and that Friday afternoon, as she was sitting in her little home office in the town of Sharpsburg, Georgia, she had just completed the final bit of her training program so that she could officially begin her new role. This was a big deal for Cathy. At the age of 54, she was late into her working life. And though this was a great opportunity, it was also a major transition, and it was quite different from what she was used to. Cathy was originally from North Carolina, but as a young woman, she'd moved to the Atlanta area, where she'd taken a job with Delta Airlines. And it was here where she'd spent almost her entire adult life. Cathy really enjoyed her time at Delta, and she'd done well for herself there. She'd had all sorts of different positions over the course of her career, working her way from the bottom up. But what had really made her successful was her outgoing and spirited personality. She was very social, to the point that her friends and family literally called her Chatty Cathy. But it was a term of endearment. She was great with people, she loved making others laugh, and she had an infectious energy that made her a lot of fun to be around. In addition to making a ton of friends through work, it was also how Cathy met her first husband, Gary. Gary was a commercial pilot who had eventually gone on to work for the FAA. He and Cathy married in 1976, and they'd had 2 daughters together named Heather and Michelle. So yeah, a surprising amount of Cathy's life had ended up revolving around the airline and travel industry. And that's part of why her new job was such a huge deal. Because when Cathy had retired from Delta after more than 30 years, she never imagined she'd start a totally new career. That was until recently, when she'd found this opportunity to work for the financial services company Edward Jones as a financial advisor. This was definitely going to be an adjustment for Cathy, but she'd gotten through much bigger life changes before. As you might have noticed, a second ago I referred to Gary as Cathy's first husband. And that's because in 1997, after 21 years of marriage, the two of them had divorced. Now, the end of the marriage had been really hard on Cathy. She'd always been a very financially independent and self-reliant person, but emotionally not as much. She craved that intimate connection that comes with having a partner, and she really wanted someone to spend her life with. And making things even more difficult, this had also happened right around the time that her daughters were entering adulthood and starting their own lives. Of course, Cathy was happy for them, but the whole thing made her feel even more alone. Well, it had been a tough few years, but eventually Cathy had found love again. After joining an online dating site in 2004, she met a guy named Alec McNaughton. Alec was this impressive, big-shot lawyer who'd had a prestigious career in Oklahoma. To give you an idea, as a weird bit of trivia, at one point he was law partners with Stephen Jones, the attorney who represented Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing case. Anyway, as Cathy and Alec started talking, she was instantly taken with him, and they discovered that they had a lot in common. They both loved reading and travel. Alec was also a divorced parent of 2, and actually he was originally from Georgia as well. So after they hit it off, Alec had decided to leave behind his successful career in Oklahoma so that he and Cathy could give their relationship a real chance. Logistically, it had been a bit rough at the start. Alec had trouble getting his Georgia law license, but it seemed like he was able to find other work. In the meantime, the romance moved quickly. The two of them moved in together at Cathy's house, and by the end of 2004, they were married. At first, Cathy's loved ones were a bit hesitant, but she seemed very happy, and by now it had been about 4.5 years, and that weekend she and Alec were going to be spending another Valentine's Day together. So yeah, by all appearances, things couldn't have been going better for Cathy. She was getting ready to take on this new challenge professionally, and as usual, it looked like she had set herself up for success. However, there was actually another reason that Cathy was proud of herself that day. Because her new job, it was only part of a much bigger change that she was planning on making. There was something that she'd been preparing for a while now, something that almost no one in her life knew about. And as she sat there finishing her work that afternoon, it felt like a sign that she was finally ready to take this next step. Sadly though, Cathy would never get that chance, because just 2 days later, her little home office would become the scene of an absolutely horrific crime.
County 911, operator, what is your emergency?
I need help right now. I just got home. My wife on the floor with blood all over her.
Okay.
And I don't think she's breathing. And she's not moving. And she's not breathing, and her eyes are not moving. There's blood on her hands and on the wall.
Okay, I'm gonna get you some help, okay?
Oh my God, what can I do?
The 911 call you just listened to was recorded at 7:37 p.m. on February 15th, 2009. It was made by Cathy's husband, 60-year-old Alec McNaughton. As you heard, Alec was frantic, and he said that he'd just gotten home to find his wife unresponsive. He told the dispatcher there was blood everywhere, and that Cathy wasn't moving or breathing. When police arrived minutes later, they were met with an eerie situation. Upon entering the house on Portage Lane, initially everything seemed totally normal. But that abruptly changed as soon as officers made their way to a back bedroom that was being used as a home office. The moment they walked in, they could see Cathy on the floor. She was lying face up right near one of the corners of the room, sort of half on top of an overturned office chair. Alec was sitting next to Cathy, and he'd been receiving instructions over the phone about how to perform life-saving measures. But sadly, as police got closer, they realized no amount of help was going to make any difference. Cathy was dead, and she had been for some time. That wasn't all the officers noticed, though. One look around the room was all they needed to determine that this was a crime scene. There was blood everywhere, on Cathy's body, soaked into the carpet around her, even on the walls. It was smeared and spattered all over the place, and it was clear Cathy had been the victim of a savage attack. An autopsy would soon reveal that Cathy had been stabbed at least 31 times. She had numerous defensive wounds, suggesting she'd fought hard with her killer. Still, based on the position of her body and her injuries, it looked like whoever had done this had caught Cathy by surprise. The attack appeared to have started at her desk, with the killer sneaking up on her while she was working. She'd been stabbed multiple times in the back before she'd fallen over, and the struggle had continued on the floor. The autopsy also showed just how over the top this crime was. Most of Cathy's stab wounds had been inflicted after she was already dead. It was likewise determined she had been here for several hours before she was found. So what had happened? How had Cathy McNaughton ended up viciously murdered in her own home? And more importantly, why? Well, when detectives got there, they were quickly convinced of one thing. This was not a robbery or any kind of home invasion. Though a back door to the property was found unlocked, nothing was actually missing, and there were plenty of things out in plain sight that a potential thief would have been interested in. For instance, Cathy was wearing thousands of dollars worth of gold and diamond jewelry when she was killed. There was also a newer model red Volvo in the garage and a vintage pickup truck in the driveway. All of these items had been left untouched. Speaking of which, there was something else peculiar about the crime scene. As I kind of hinted at before, almost everything related to the murder was confined to this one area of the home. In fact, if you didn't know any better, and you didn't go into Cathy's office, you wouldn't have known anything had happened there at all. Nothing was out of place, it didn't seem like anything had been searched through, it just looked like a normal house. The whole thing was strange enough that investigators soon began to wonder if this was a clue in and of itself, especially after they discovered one other area of interest. Inside a bathroom right next to the office, they found a sponge, a towel, and a container of bleach that had been left in the shower. In other words, evidence of a possible cleanup. This was unnerving for a couple of reasons. For starters, detectives worried that it might mean valuable evidence had been destroyed. But it was also disturbing because, like many of the other details they'd uncovered so far, it suggested Cathy's killer was someone she knew. I mean, she'd been ambushed in her own home during the middle of the day. The attack itself was total overkill, and the perpetrator seemed to have no problem hanging around and cleaning up afterwards. All of it implied familiarity, that police should be looking for someone close to Cathy, someone with a deeply personal motive. If that were the case, though, there was an obvious place to start, and that meant it was time for them to have an uncomfortable conversation with Cathy's husband. As some members of the investigative team continued processing the crime scene, detectives with the Coweta County Sheriff's Office asked Alec to come down to the station. Given what they'd already learned, he was an immediate person of interest, not to mention that he was the one who'd alerted them to the crime in the first place. And so when they sat down for an interview, they asked Alec as many questions as they could think of, starting with what his and Cathy's relationship was like and what he'd been doing that day. Alec explained that February 15th had actually started out as a day of celebration. After waking up early like he usually did to make them both coffee, he and Cathy had done a little belated Valentine's Day thing. They'd exchanged cards and chocolates and enjoyed a quiet morning together. Around 11:30, though, Alec said that he left the house. Cathy needed to finish a few things for work, so he decided he'd spend the afternoon visiting his mother.
She said, I need to go do some work. And I said, fine. I'm going to go up to my mother's.
Alec stated that he'd done a few things around the house for his mom, and that afterwards they'd gone out to a barbecue restaurant. He'd actually called Cathy to see if she wanted to meet them, but when he phoned the house, he couldn't get a hold of her.
She didn't answer. And so I figured she was out. And so I drove home, and it was dark by that time when I got home.
Initially, Alec wasn't all that concerned when Cathy didn't pick up. He assumed she'd gone out as well and that he'd see her later. But when he got home around 7:30 and he saw that all the lights in the house were still off, even though it was now dark out, he got an uneasy feeling. Sure enough, when he went inside and started searching for Cathy, he came across the awful scene in her office. As for who would want to do something like this, Alec said that he had no idea, but he claimed he was not involved in this. He insisted that he and Cathy had a great relationship. The two of them had felt so lucky to have found each other late in life, and he didn't know what he was going to do without her.
Who would want to hurt your wife? I don't know. She's the sweetest person I've ever met. I loved her to the depths of my heart.
You consider yourself to have a good marriage?
Absolutely.
Would she say the same thing?
Yes.
As you might have noticed, Alec was very calm and matter-of-fact throughout the interview, and this was something detectives picked up on as well. He didn't sound very upset, even while recounting the worst parts of what he'd seen and experienced. When asked about this directly, Alec said that as a lawyer, he was kind of used to clinically laying out information like this. But as the interview continued, it seemed like reality set in a little more.
You gotta understand, my life's over. I got nothing. I'm alone. You know, I can't go to work with my wife dead. I can't go live in that house with my wife killed there. I got nothing. Ever. But my life's over.
And I'm not trying to pour salt on the wound, but your wife's not just dead. You know what I mean? Back on before we walked out, your wife's been murdered.
I know. And I know you guys are going to find it.
That's as bad as it gets.
The worst emotional feeling a human being can suffer is the loss, unexpected, preventable loss of a child. The second worst is the loss of your spouse. I've had both. And you know what? I don't give a shit if I live anymore. I really don't. I got nothing to live for. But I want you to find whoever killed my wife, okay?
You know we will.
So yeah, investigators eventually did see a more emotional side of Alec. If you're wondering about that bit where he talked about losing a child, he was referring to his daughter Alexis. Alexis had died in a car accident at the age of just 22, and this had actually happened fairly early on into Cathy and Alec's marriage. Even with Alec opening up a little more, though, police still had to verify what he was telling them. So after finishing their interview, they started looking into his alibi. The big thing detectives wanted to know was where Alec was during Cathy's murder. They were specifically focused on a window of time between about noon and 2:30 p.m. that day. This was based on estimates from the medical examiner who conducted Cathy's autopsy, as well as a phone call she'd had with one of her friends. Cathy had spoken to a friend in California late that morning, and the call had ended around 11:55, meaning she was still alive at this time. Well, Alec claimed he'd already left the house by this point, something that was backed up by his mother, June. She confirmed he'd arrived between 12 and 12:30, and she lived in Sandy Springs, a suburb on the opposite side of Atlanta. The trip would have taken Alec about an hour from Sharpsburg, meaning he would have had to have left before the crime. If you recall, Alec also mentioned calling Cathy while he was out that day, asking her if she wanted to meet him and his mom for barbecue. During one of those calls, he'd left a message on the home answering machine, which police were able to find and listen to. It had been recorded just after 2:30 p.m., which further lined up with Alec being in Sandy Springs at the time of the killing.
Hey, honey, it's me. I'm up at Mother's. We may go get some barbecue. I didn't know if you wanted to meet us. Probably not. I could bring you some home. Or we were supposed to go out and have dinner tonight. So give me a call. I love you, baby. Bye.
With Alec's alibi appearing to check out, detectives decided to move on. But they felt like their underlying theory was still correct. They believed Cathy's killer was someone who knew her very well. Someone who, based on the brutal way she'd been attacked, had a lot of anger towards her. The problem was that as police started branching out and speaking with other members of Cathy's family, there wasn't anyone in her life who really fit this description. Everyone was devastated when they were told what had happened, especially Cathy's daughters, Heather and Michelle. But as far as they knew, everyone loved her. She was not the kind of person who made enemies. If anything, she saw the best in people to a fault. However, as authorities searched through Cathy's personal life, it soon became clear there was one other obvious suspect: her ex-husband, Gary Mendenhall. As I said earlier, Gary and Cathy had been married for more than 2 decades. They'd been divorced for quite a while, and Gary now lived in Texas. But as detectives started asking around, they discovered something very interesting. You see, Gary was actually in Atlanta at the time of the murder. In fact, he'd flown into town the same day that Cathy was killed. After hearing this, police wondered, were there potentially some lingering feelings there? Was Gary maybe jealous of Cathy moving on with someone new? It certainly seemed possible, particularly when they learned another alarming detail.
When did y'all get married?
We got married February 14th, 1976.
It's remarkable to me that y'all's anniversary is the day before she died.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Gary and Cathy's wedding anniversary was Valentine's Day, the day before the murder. Understandably, that timing was impossible to ignore, so police asked Gary about this, as well as what he was doing in Atlanta. Gary said that he realized this looked incredibly bad, but it really wasn't as suspicious as it seemed. He said that because of his job with the FAA, he traveled a lot, and he was actually based out of an office in Denver, Colorado, so he was constantly flying around for work. Gary explained that he made frequent stops in Atlanta, but that this usually had nothing to do with Cathy. Their 2 daughters still lived in the area as well, so when he was in town, he tried to visit as much as he could, and he said that's what he was doing on February 15th. He was spending some time with Heather, helping her clean out her house. As for his relationship with Cathy, Gary said things were generally good. They'd gotten to a point where they were friends, and sometimes they even meet up and have dinner with their daughters together when he was in Atlanta. He was adamant that he never would have done anything to hurt Cathy. He said the whole thing was just a terrible coincidence. As detectives were talking to Gary, though, something else caught their attention. He had a visible wound to the thumb on his right hand. Given how Cathy was killed, this stood out. It's common in stabbing cases for the perpetrator to also end up with injuries, either from their hands slipping onto the blade of the knife, or even from accidentally cutting or stabbing themselves during the chaos of the attack. And Gary was right-handed, so conceivably this is how he would have held a weapon.
What happened to your thumb?
Oh, right there. I was cleaning up Heather's apartment here yesterday and washing the countertop, and I caught some kind of rack she had there. Pulled it up.
Gary seemingly had an explanation for everything, and his story made sense, but the real test was whether authorities could verify his whereabouts on the day of the murder. Well, it turned out that while Gary had been in Atlanta on February 15th, his flight hadn't arrived until 3:15 p.m. He also had records showing that he'd immediately rented a car after landing and had checked into a hotel at 4:10. In other words, Gary was telling the truth. He had nothing to do with this. Based on the timeline, when Gary got off his plane, Cathy was already dead. This left detectives in a tough spot, though. Beyond the two people they'd already looked into, they didn't really have any other suspects. And unfortunately, the forensic evidence at the crime scene wasn't much help either. Within days, it was confirmed that all of the blood there belonged to Cathy. Similarly, the only fingerprints in the home were from her and Alec. And despite testing every knife they could find inside the residence, authorities hadn't been able to locate the murder weapon. Police were at a dead end, or so it seemed. Because just when it looked like there was nowhere left to go, they would get some new information. Information that would make this already heartbreaking crime infinitely more haunting. At this point in the investigation, the Coweta County Sheriff's Office were continuing their conversations and interviews with Cathy's loved ones, but they were also branching out. Specifically, they'd gone to the media, appealing for members of the public who might have any information to come forward. And that's how they got a call from a guy named Jerome Langford, who told them a story that would begin to change the case. Jerome told detectives that he was a former co-worker of Cathy's at Delta. The two of them had worked together for a couple of years at the company's head office at the Atlanta airport. In fact, their cubicles had been right next to each other. As a result, they'd gotten pretty close, and they'd stayed in touch even after Cathy retired. Jerome explained that about 2 weeks before the murder, on February 5th, he and Cathy met up for lunch at the airport's food court. At first, they were mostly just talking and catching up, but he could tell something was off. Cathy was acting strangely, and she wasn't her usual bubbly self. Finally, he found out why when she dropped a huge piece of news on him. She said that her marriage was over and that she was getting ready to leave her husband. Unfortunately, Cathy hadn't gone into a lot of detail, so Jerome didn't know too much more, but he said it sounded like this had been building for a while. Part of it seemed to be financial, but Cathy also hinted at something else, saying that Alec was not the man she thought he was. She told Jerome about her new job as well, saying that once she was officially finished with her training at Edward Jones, she planned to tell Alec they were done. Of course, this was the complete opposite of what investigators had heard from Alec. During his interview, he made it seem like he and Cathy were crazy about each other. I mean, he was talking about Valentine's cards and chocolates and spending a romantic morning together. It all raised the question. If Alec was lying about his and Cathy's relationship, what else was he lying about? Well, when detectives started digging deeper into Alec's background, what they found was incredibly unsettling. As I mentioned before, police had already spoken to Alec's mother, June. This conversation hadn't raised any red flags. June said Alec loved Cathy and that he had always been a great son and devoted husband. But Alec was also a brother. He was the oldest of the 5 children in his family. And when investigators began reaching out to his siblings, they painted a much darker picture of his personality, particularly his 3 younger sisters. They said that while Alec might have looked like this happy, charismatic, and successful guy on the surface, that couldn't have been further from the truth. The reality was he was a deeply twisted person, and he had been for basically his whole life. The sisters told detectives that when they were kids, Alec was put in charge of babysitting them. And he had used this situation to systematically terrorize and abuse them. Alec would do things like lock them in bathrooms for extended periods of time, beat them with belts and coat hangers, and make all sorts of disturbing threats. According to one of the sisters, Julie, one of Alec's favorite things to do was choke her to the point that she blacked out and then let her fall down the stairs while she was unconscious. Apparently, Alec thought this was absolutely hilarious. This had gone on for years, but despite that, none of the siblings had ever dared to tell anybody about what was happening to them. At the time, this was because Alec had explicitly threatened them, saying that he would only make it worse for them if they did. But they remained silent even after they all grew up. They said this is because they were still terrified of Alec and what he might do, and as a result, they'd kept this awful family secret. It got worse though, because according to Alec's sisters, the violence hadn't stopped with them. And that's when they revealed another bombshell. Cathy wasn't Alec's second wife. She was his fourth. And all of his romantic relationships had followed the same chilling pattern. In the beginning, Alec turned on the charm, and he could be really impressive if he wanted to. But eventually, that monstrous side of him came out, especially towards the end of his relationships, when he sensed he was losing control over his partner. The stories were horrific. During an argument with Alec's first wife, he'd attacked her with a broken Coke bottle, and he'd beaten her so badly she'd ended up with a swollen face and a broken nose. Immediately afterwards, he'd dragged her over to a mirror and said, quote, "Look what you forced me to do to you." Near the end of Alec's second marriage, he'd thrown his wife into a glass table. But it was when authorities spoke to his third wife, Susan Knox, that they realized that not only were these incidents happening over and over again, they were also escalating. Susan told investigators about something that had happened in late September of 2001. At the time, she and Alec hadn't officially divorced, but they were separated and living in different cities in Oklahoma. Remember Alec's daughter I told you about before, Alexis? Well, on this particular day, Alec got angry at her. The situation had started over nothing, apparently an argument about a phone bill or something, but it escalated quickly, and Alec became so enraged that he drove over to Susan's house and ended up cutting the phone lines before threatening them and himself with a shotgun.
Oklahoma City 911.
Hi, my parents have had a huge fight, and the phone lines are dead. And my dad said he's going to kill us, and he's capable of doing that.
Okay, what is your name?
Alexis McNaughton.
Fortunately, Alexis still had her cell phone, so she was able to call 911 and police arrived before things spiraled further out of control. But it was easy to see how things could have ended differently. And as far as Alec's sisters and all of his former wives were concerned, that's exactly what had happened now. As soon as they heard about Cathy's murder, they were convinced Alec was responsible, especially after they learned that Cathy had been planning on leaving him at the time of her death. You might be wondering, though, if all of that was true, why hadn't detectives heard about it sooner? Why hadn't Cathy's own family raised the alarm about Alec themselves? Well, from the sounds of it, they had extremely limited information. Remember, all of the stuff with Alec's sisters was a total secret, and while police had been notified about some of the domestic violence incidents with his ex-wives, most of these had happened in other states, and no charges had ever been pursued against him. Everyone had been too afraid to speak out. This isn't to say that Cathy's family was silent, though. They had shared some of their suspicions during conversations with investigators. Heather and Michelle said that the relationship definitely wasn't as rosy as Alec was making it seem, and their mom's murder had also caused them to reflect on something that had happened early on into the marriage. One morning, in the spring of 2006, Alec and Cathy got into an argument as Cathy was getting ready for work. It's unclear what that argument was about, but what we do know is that when she tried to leave the house, Alec flew into a rage. After following her outside, he pulled her from her car and proceeded to drag her across the driveway by her hair. Cathy had been left with a bunch of scrapes, cuts, and bruises, enough that she'd avoided going into her office for several days. But still, she hadn't really told anyone about this. Her daughters only found out when Heather later called Cathy and invited her over for dinner. She kept making excuses about why she couldn't come, until finally she revealed what had happened and said that she was in no state to go out in public. Now, Heather and Michelle were incredibly upset and angry when they found out about this, and they begged their mom to report the situation to police. But Cathy didn't want to. She said Alec wasn't in his right mind. This had taken place right around the time that Alexis had died in that car accident, and Cathy said that he was dealing with a lot of grief. They talked to his doctor, they were handling things, and she had the situation under control. Of course, at the time, no one knew about any of those details about Alec's past, so Cathy's daughters had sort of left things alone and trusted what she was telling them. But sadly, as they and everyone else were about to learn, these were not the only warning signs they had missed. With the investigation refocused on Alec McNaughton, detectives with the Coweta County Sheriff's Office decided to return to the crime scene. As suspicious as they were, they didn't actually have any hard evidence against Alec, so they were hoping to find anything that might have been overlooked. Well, it was here, while searching the house for the second time, that they would make a massive discovery. And that brings us back to what I told you about at the very beginning of this video. While looking around in one of the home's bedrooms, investigators came across this black lockbox. It was sitting on a shelf at the back of one of Cathy's closets. And as detectives started going through it, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Inside the box was dozens of documents. It was a mixture of handwritten notes, financial records, police reports, and other papers, all of which told a disturbing story. These documents made it clear that, as everyone now feared, Alec had been abusing Cathy for basically their entire marriage. And what police had found? This was all of the evidence Cathy had been collecting and keeping for years as proof of what was happening to her. The handwritten pages were particularly disturbing. In them, Cathy listed a number of incidents involving physical violence, adding further notes in the margins, such as, quote, "threatened to kill me 3 times." She also wrote down doctor's visits and other corroborating details. But as police soon learned, that was just the beginning. On top of the lockbox were 3 disposable cameras. All of these cameras had been used, but there were no photos around. When the film on them was developed, the results were shocking. The pictures were all of Cathy, covered in bruises, scrapes, cuts, and other injuries. In addition to her notes, she had been keeping a photo record of what Alec was doing to her, beginning with that incident I told you about where Alec had attacked her in the driveway. If you can believe it, the physical abuse was only part of the story, though, because Cathy hadn't just been documenting Alec's horrifying behavior. She was also investigating him. After it became apparent that she had no idea who she'd married, she'd started looking into Alec on her own. And she'd actually found a lot of the same stuff police had now uncovered, including a copy of an incident report involving one of Alec's previous wives. The notes and documents also shed further light on something Jerome Langford had mentioned in his interview, the fact that Cathy and Alec were arguing about their finances. And after going through some of the records in Cathy's lockbox, it wasn't hard to understand why. You know how I said earlier that when Alec and Cathy started dating, Alec had left behind his legal practice in Oklahoma? At the time, he'd made it seem like he was making this big sacrifice for the good of the relationship. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. You see, Alec's career was effectively over. While the exact details are kind of murky, what we do know is that he'd been involved in all sorts of alarming incidents, some of which went back decades. For example, remember his former law partner that I told you about earlier, Stephen Jones? Well, in 1987, he and Alec were on the opposite sides of a medical malpractice case. During the proceedings, Stephen apparently said something Alec didn't like, and Alec responded to this by showing up at Stephen's office and beating him to the point that the case was later referred to the Attorney General's office. More recently, in 2003, he had been required to surrender his Oklahoma bar license after he was accused of illegally taking money from clients. According to reports from the time, Alec had a Swiss bank account, and it looked like he'd actually been planning to flee to Switzerland, but he wasn't prosecuted after agreeing to give the money back. So yeah, much like with the many domestic violence incidents involving his exes, Alec was mostly able to avoid the consequences of his actions. But by the time he and Cathy got together, he'd completely torched his legal career. He was completely broke, and he also owed a combined $100,000 in back taxes to the federal government and multiple state governments. Now, Cathy didn't know any of that in the beginning. She only discovered that Alec was lying to her once they were already married. Despite this, she tried to help him. She'd refinanced her house to pay off a good chunk of his debt. She'd agreed to put Alec's remaining assets in her name so that they couldn't be seized, and she'd supported them both financially. Alec had paid her back by never holding down a steady job and brutally abusing her over the course of their 4.5-year marriage. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing about all of this, though, is that even after Cathy started investigating Alec and she learned what a monster he truly was, it was obvious she'd struggled with what to do about her situation. In fact, included in some of her notes was a pro-con list. In the pro column, she jotted down words about Alec, like sweet, loving, and handsome. In the cons, she had written no sex, depression, bankruptcy. That being said, it seemed that Cathy had grown less conflicted over time. Based on what authorities found, it appeared that recently things had turned a corner. Cathy was done being Alec's piggy bank and his punching bag. She had finally gotten up the courage to leave him. All she was waiting for was to finish the training for her new job. And as we know, that had happened on February 13th. Just 2 days later, she was dead. You might be wondering, though, what about Alec's alibi? Wasn't he with his mother at the time of the murder? Well, that's what they both had said. But as part of their renewed focus on Alec, detectives also obtained cell phone records from the day of the murder. And those records were clear. Alec's story was a lie. The data showed that while Alec had gone to Sandy Springs that afternoon, he'd arrived at his mother's place much later than he claimed. The most damning part, though, was that message he'd left around 2:30 p.m. The records revealed that the call had been made while Alec was still in Sharpsburg. The call had pinged the cell tower closest to Cathy's house. In other words, Alec was there during that crucial window of time when the crime took place. With all of this harrowing new information in hand, detectives came up with a theory as to what had really happened on February 15th. They suspected that early that afternoon, Alec and Cathy had gotten into an argument. During the fight, Cathy informed Alec that they were done. She wanted a divorce, and she wanted Alec out of her house. At first, Alec pretended to play along, but in reality, he was just biding his time. While Cathy finished some work, Alec grabbed a knife, snuck up behind her, and viciously stabbed her to death. Detectives theorized that once Cathy was dead, Alec got to work covering up what he had done. As a lawyer, he knew he needed to clean up any evidence of himself at the scene, and he also needed to establish an alibi. He'd left the message on the answering machine to make it look like he was somewhere else, and they suspected he disposed of the murder weapon and the clothes he wore during the killing on the way to his mother's house. After returning to the house that night, Alec pretended to stumble across Cathy's body, but it turned out he'd made one other mistake. If you recall, Alec received instructions about how to perform CPR when he called 911. Well, when police took another look at the clothing he'd been wearing that evening, they realized there was no blood on it. Of course, Alec hadn't actually performed life-saving measures because he knew Cathy was already dead. Ironically, him not having blood on him was actually much more suspicious because it meant that when he walked into that room, he had information that only the killer would have known. After all of these revelations, Alec was brought back in for a second time. He was questioned about a bunch of the things that detectives had learned, but especially that new phone evidence.
You made a phone call that I've heard the message to your answer machine telling your wife, I'm up here at Mother's, we're about to get some barbecue. When that phone call was made and that message was left, the records say that your phone was within 5 or 6 miles of the cell phone tower closest to your home.
I don't see how that could be. It's impossible.
How can I rectify this?
I don't know. I mean, it's just wrong.
You told me that you left your house between 11 or 12. It's not true. It's a lie. You were at your house or you were near your house. Your phone records prove it.
I don't know about the cell phone call, but I know that's not the case.
As you might imagine, this was not very convincing to detectives, but it was obvious that they weren't getting anywhere. No matter how hard they pushed, Alec refused to tell the truth. In fact, the more direct they got with their questions, the more obnoxious he became.
Did you murder your wife?
Hell no, I didn't murder my wife.
Mr. McNaughton, we have obtained a warrant for your arrest.
You're going to convict me for murdering my wife that I love over a cell phone?
No, sir, a jury's going to do that. All I do is gather information. Your alibi is no good, and there existed a motive.
What's the motive?
The motive is she was going to leave you.
I'll hire some very good lawyers to defend me, and they'll figure it out. I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that the jury's going to convict me on what you got.
So yeah, Alec's idea of an explanation was basically just to act as smug as possible about the whole thing. And this continued even after he was arrested and charged with Cathy's murder. When the case went to trial in August of 2010, he even took the stand. His defense basically boiled down to this. Everyone was a liar except for him. Although he did carve out some time as well to try and lecture the jury about the meaning of reasonable doubt and what their job was in terms of reaching a verdict. Honestly, it's hard to overstate how arrogant Alec was. For example, it came out during the court proceedings that Cathy had actually warned him before her murder that she had enough evidence of his abuse to go to the police. One of the items recovered from the home between Alec's arrest and the trial was a cassette recording that had been made during one of Cathy and Alec's arguments. In that recording, Cathy could be heard saying, quote, "You threatened to hit me. Don't you ever do that to me again. I've got pictures, I've got affidavits, I've got enough, and if you ever threaten me again, I'll get a phone and call 911. Despite this, it appears Alec never found or even tried to find the file of information and evidence Cathy was keeping on him. Probably because he either didn't believe she was serious or because he just didn't think it mattered. Of course, Cathy herself likely never imagined that her lockbox and those disposable cameras she'd used to document her injuries would one day be used at her own murder trial. But in an equally tragic and poetic way, they sort of gave her a voice during the proceedings. It was like she was speaking from beyond the grave. While this was undoubtedly some of the most powerful evidence presented during the case, it wasn't the only way that karma finally caught up with Alec McNaughton. In a fitting final twist, many of his previous victims testified for the prosecution. This included all 3 of Alec's ex-wives and at least 2 of his 4 siblings. In the end, Alec was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to life on each of the murder counts, plus 20 years on the assault charge, to be served consecutively, meaning he has virtually zero chance of ever being released. According to the most up-to-date information we could find, Alec McNaughton is currently incarcerated at Coastal State Prison in Savannah, Georgia. I think we've pretty much wrapped up all of the loose ends here, but there's one last thing I wanted to address before we finish. I have a feeling some people are going to have a hard time understanding why Cathy never went to the police about what Alec was doing to her. I mean, what was the point of collecting all of that proof of his abuse if she never used it? Well, this is one of the really scary things about domestic violence. While physical abuse tends to be what gets the most attention, it's the psychological aspect to these situations that's arguably more powerful and dangerous. There's a whole host of ways this can manifest. Some victims feel like they won't be believed if they come forward. Others think that their partners can change. Many are made to feel like it's their fault the abuse is taking place. But the result is always the same. Victims feel trapped and isolated, and it keeps them stuck in this awful cycle. The sad truth is that for many, breaking that cycle often feels harder than just staying in the bad situation. Studies suggest it takes an average of 7 attempts to leave an abusive relationship. And even then, statistically speaking, taking that courageous step is the most dangerous time for victims. And sadly, that's precisely how things played out in this case. I think the most frightening part about Cathy's story, though, is that it's possible to know all of this logically and yet still find yourself in a situation like this. By all accounts, Cathy was a very smart and successful woman. According to her daughter, she always taught them growing up that it was important to be independent and to not rely on someone else, especially financially. But we all have our vulnerabilities. For Cathy, it seems those were emotional. She wanted to be loved, and she wanted someone to share her life with, and Alec was able to exploit that. My point here isn't to suggest Cathy did anything wrong. I want to be clear. She did not. It's to show that this can happen to anyone. No one is immune. And that's what's so pernicious about domestic violence. It eats away at a person from the inside out, to the point that often it's hard to make sense of things from the outside looking in. One of the most heartbreaking things for me researching this story was just imagining Cathy writing those notes, taking those pictures, and collecting all of those documents in her lockbox, while at the same time her loved ones were in the dark. As her daughter Heather later put it during an interview, quote, "She told her friends and me some information, but not one of us knew everything that was going on in the relationship." And that, I think, is the one thing that we all need to take away from this case. People like Alec McNaughton, they can only exist as long as victims stay silent. And while it might not always feel like it, speaking out is the best way to expose these monsters for what they truly are. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, One of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.